Okay, I'm not sure how quickly I can do this, but I'm going to try to at least be concise. I want to respond to this wonderful little video that Christopher at Cult of the Amateur had posted called Language, Transcendence, and Religion. And he was being somewhat critical of me, and I appreciate his criticisms. And he was suggesting that Heidegger, as he suggests here, he suspects that it's really just psychology masquerading as ontology. I do want to agree wholeheartedly with some of the concerns and reservations about Heidegger's involvement with the Nazi Party and all of that. But I really do disagree with the alignment of Heidegger into Descartes' subjectivism. If anything, I would say this is the bulk of Heidegger's critique. And Heidegger so distanced himself from Husserl that even though Being and Time is dedicated to Husserl, there's no mention of intentionality, the central discovery of phenomenology, and instead Heidegger radicalizes it and existentializes it by taking it out of something like cognitive function as it was for Husserl, or eidetic function, or nomadic, and instead he moves it into the praxial ways that the body moves in with the world. And what he does is he just accomplishes the intentionality orientation of Husserl by including hyphens into all of his expressions, like readiness to hand, presence at hand, being in the world. I mean, we could give a lot of being toward death. We could give lots of different examples. Okay, what I'm going to try to do instead of going to the Heidegger stuff is I'm going to try to maybe clarify this issue of the difference between transcendence and the transcendent, because I think people are misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm not making an appeal to a transcendent, that is a supernatural realm or some sort of metaphysical realm, but by the timeless, or what I'm talking about is the negentropic. I don't mean a super fantastical, although it starts to lead to that when we get to some of these mathematical questions, and maybe I'll get to that. But I'm really just talking about transcendence refers to, I guess, the different ways that different entities, different beings open to what's beyond them or outside of them or more than them. That is, what is the range of mediacy that we can find through different kinds of beings that are to be found here in the world. Now, and this is why I think it is an ontology rather than just a psychology. And what I'm going to try to do is first just lay out this kind of scale of transcendence that I think we can witness throughout the natural world. Now, people have criticized me and said, well, why do you use the expression phylogenetic scale? That's outdated. Each animal is successfully has found its place in its niche. Scale doesn't work. Okay, even if I grant that, and I think there's some sense to those concerns, I guess I do want to say there does nonetheless seem to be, for lack of a better term, an escalating scale, that is a widening and expanding scale of degrees or range of mediacy that we can find throughout nature. So I'm going to start with, we'll call it, for lack of a better term, just the inorganic, but it's matter that we're going to say is not alive. It's at a certain level of analysis. You have molecules and atoms of inorganic matter that are inert. They don't seem to have a wide, expansive range of commerce with their larger environment. Now, it certainly is something like atomic decay. It's not that it's a wholly given substance once and for all, but I think that the range of mediacy seems limited. For example, at least when you move to something like vegetation. Now, when vegetation emerges, vegetation, plant life is very interesting. Plant life, trees, they open to their larger environment. They communicate with other trees around them. Plants, even without a nervous system, they behave, they bend toward light. But it's hard to think of making a plant anxiety-ridden or making it filled with fear. Or, see, a plant without sensory organs and without motility, it can't flee from predators. It can't have anxiety about its own search for food. It can't experience hunger as something that's its own problem. Instead, hunger, or if there is a nutritive commerce, it's just a condition that's felt to be environmental. Now, it's related to it in a kind of direct immediacy. And again, some of this gets very complicated. Do plants have a very far reach of how they're able to interact? Yeah, I think so. But it's a spatial one. Now we're going to get to the difference between spatial interaction and temporal in a second as mediacy transcendence levels sort of escalate up. But so if we move from the inorganic to the vegetative, and then we move to something like the animal, but the pre-mammal, that is the pre-limbic system, or the animal whose emotional ranges are quite limited, I think we do want to say that, I would want to say that not only do we have degrees of openness in terms of, the sensory capacities, that is vision and hearing and sight, and each one of these are kinds of transcendence. Each one of them offer modes of opening to the world and relating to it and relating self to the larger world that's perceived around it. But once you get to emotions and limbic systems and the complex feelings of mammals and higher mammals, the emotions are a kind of disclosure of world through a transcendence of self-mediacy in terms of environment. And take dogs just as an example. Dogs have quite an amazing range of affect. You can make a dog very neurotic. You can alienate it in its self-relation by stressing the dog out. Can you stress a plant out? I think you can, but the kinds of stresses that are between plant, insect, and mammal, they seem to be very different. There's a range of inward mediation as well as a kind of range of outward concerns. And again, the inward outward is we're still largely dealing with spatial metaphors. That is, the first one, the inorganic, is what Korzybski called chemistry binding. Chemistry binding is like the mode of transcendence there, where the chemical makeup is binding to and gathering with other chemicals around it in various forms of relation, but it's still highly limited. By the time you get to life and various forms of organic process that includes a biological beginning and a biological cessation and developmental cycles. So, there's a kind of temporal elongation that comes with life that's perhaps to be excluded from the inorganic. Again, notion of developmental periods, of life cycles, of ontogenetic order. There's all these kinds of things. But the organism's forms of transcendence are largely spatial. And each level builds upon the subsequent levels. So it depends on the level of analysis where we're trying to get at this issue of transcendence. By the time you get to what we're going to call human transcendence is a kind of time binding, and it's an opening to the world, not only through the nutritive commerce that goes on as I ingest various forms of life. I eat an apple or something like this. It's not simply that, but it's that humans engage in a kind of collective learning that transcends memory. There is a historicity to culture and tradition, and I think the more that we try to understand the human expanse of transcendence, it includes the roving of space, the fact that humans are able to live in any geographical region, the fact that people even imagine trying to leave the planet. This really shows the range of transcendence that the human is open to. We've put a flag on the moon. We're outside of the atmosphere. This seems to be pretty radically different than other organisms who do seem to be not only more geographically bound in their natural habitat, or sort of we can define what region they're natural to, whereas humans are, we've just spread all over, but now we've even left the atmosphere. And if you ask, well, how is that possible? Okay, now we're getting into the interesting questions. It would seem, if we want to just look at it, just step back and look at it, it seems as if humans have been opened to transcendence. And when I say to transcendence, I mean various forms of mediating their relationship to what's around them in terms of space and time. And as soon as you introduce all of these issues of mathematics, it gets to be very complicated. Now, so if we take prime numbers, if we take pi, if we take algorithms, some of this does, it starts to suggest that there is an orderliness to the cosmos that is more than human. And we need to go back here and to maybe circle back just for a second on why this is an ontology, not just a psychology. Well, it's an ontology because we're trying to account for the different range of the kinds of being for different beings here on the planet. That is, different organisms seem to be opened to different ranges of experience, and it's sometimes called a disinhibiting ring. You know, that organisms have a disinhibiting ring, and what's allowed to enter into experience varies. The human seems to be in some way as constrained as every other organism is. It only has certain sensory capacities, and if they don't have the capacity, for example, to see ultraviolet, well, it's somehow not available. And yet we can make technologies that disclose those to us. And as soon as we introduce tool making and technology making as part of language, it seems like language issues a transcendence of both inner self-transformation and of modifying how we relate to the larger world. And this does seem to be an ontological issue. That is, if you take something like memory or language, if you're going to try to say that that's just psychological, I think in some way it misses how nature itself enabled these capacities to emerge in one of its part of itself, or the organism itself evolved memory, and that's an ontological characteristic of nature. We just happen to be that part of nature where it can be localized or found or manifest, something like this. Okay, I think to say that language opens us to the eidetic realm, and when I say the eidetic realm, I mean the realm that's not reducible to the empirical realm. It's not to say that it's not grounded in a materialist physical reality. The problem is that relations are as real as things, and some relations are simply logical relations rather than material relations. And logical relations are real. They can at least be deduced from within a system. So take an expression, say I take the expression two, just the number two. See, two, even though it, we could say it's an eidetic reality, it's a concept that refers to nothing empirical in the world, but just general notion of any two. There is a sense that 2 equals 2 over 1, or it equals 6 over 3. And so there's a sense of, I guess, of information value that can be found there, that can be deduced and inferred. And it's not, I guess, reducible to a single expression. That is, the expression is substitutable, and that's part of what makes the numerical system, which is, it's a human creation, but it's a human creation that reflects the order that evolved the human. I mean, the human itself is part of a larger order, and math is an expression of the order that created us. So I think some of this does get very problematic. Okay, now I know I've been talking too long already, but I'm going to continue to ramble on a little bit further about maybe this issue of information. And I want to talk just briefly, because I've seen so many comments go on about this discussion of information on some of the videos. And one particular fella, Socrates or something like this, kept suggesting, really trying to advocate the idea that information doesn't exist in the world, that it only exists in the brain. And as much as I want to say, okay, there's some sense to be had there, yes, there is some good logic to say that if the brain doesn't register the information, well, where is it? But that makes the brain necessary but not sufficient condition. And in fact, one could argue that we're increasingly externalizing our brain, and the only way for you to get a handle on the conscious control of the information that gets in your brain is to somehow externalize it. So if you take things like speech and writing, speech and writing they're more than representations or empty vessels or containers for information that's in your brain. They're ways of managing and organizing the way that your brain then comes to make sense of it. And I think I want to get at that a couple of different ways. First off is to say that, yeah, language is never private property. Language is always between you and other people, and you always mean a little bit more and a little bit less than you intend to, because words are overpopulated with meanings. Words have histories. And see, when I say that language is negentropic, I want to get at that. Try to think just for a second here about the difference between a word which can grow in meaning, and a word has a history, and it can be used by speakers over many generations. It can unify people over space. It can unify people over time. And, there's a sense in which, yeah, the word doesn't really decay. Now, the word is a principle of repetition. Now, try to take that just as an example of compare that to an antique. See, if I have an antique, say I have this old table. Now, the table is subject to entropy. It can get dinged up, broken eventually. But if I have an antique table in mint condition, it's as if its value grows by not having lost any part of itself, or it been, again, sort of preserved in a state that's kept it from its entropic flow into disorder. It seems so different than a word. A word is not an antique if by that we mean something that's retained its integrity. No, a word grows by its increased interaction with other words. It changes if by addition, but it doesn't change as if by loss and decay. I mean, try to imagine an antique word, quotes, in mint condition, that is a word that's been preserved from any kind of loss through decomposition. I mean, some of it doesn't really make sense. I think it sort of forces the issue, right? I mean, I've said this before. If somebody says, don't eat any apples, there's a shortage. It can make sense to us. But if somebody says, shh, don't use the word apples, there's a shortage, the person's obviously gone crazy, right? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I think what we need to do, at the very least, is to make a distinction between three kinds of information. And this was Peirce, and this maybe circles back to this earlier discussion about kinds of transcendence. What Peirce, and this is Holenstein, Jacobson, it's the non-Saussurean tradition. I think Saussure gets people into trouble here. But if you go with Peirce, you have to say that there's an index, an icon, and a symbol. And he's trying to account for the kinds of information that are pervading nature. And he was a chemist, and some of this, a philosopher and a chemist, but some of this is trying to get at the way chemicals are able to exchange various kinds of information. And, life itself has various kinds of information that's used in your body indexically. The hormonal system is a kind of analogic indexical system. And we're not even going to get to analog digital, but let's just stick with index, icon, and symbol. So an index it's part of the materiality, and it's a factual contiguity. So right now as I'm speaking, I'm just going to try to stick with the spoken word here. The spoken word can be analyzed at three different levels. That is, it's a sign that is an index, and when it operates at the level of index, it has to do with the acoustical production. It has to have a certain sound value, has to have a certain pitch, rhythm, rate. All of those things that are related to the material production of the sound, those are all the speech as an index. Even identifying who the person is who's speaking, that's part of the indexical quality of the sign. The next level up of that sign, which includes the prior level, but the next level up is the iconicity of it. That is, when I'm speaking, each word rhymes with other words, and that's how poetry becomes possible. And the number of words that a word rhymes with, see, oddly enough, this is related to that question of how 2 over 1 equals 2. That is, some words have poetic potentialities in them because of the kind of physical acoustics that come into play as we're producing them, and then the rhyming sequence. Now, this has all kinds of social value as well. I'm sure you're probably aware of this. Many people are aware of this. That in many oral societies, there's pretty strict taboos over uses of words. And so, if your mother-in-law is over, you wouldn't say her name, and you wouldn't even use a word that would rhyme with her name. You would be caught in suspicious. You would make people be concerned, I guess, in some way if you get caught doing that. And it sort of illustrates that, again, language has informational value that's sometimes implicated there rather than directly spelled out. Okay, the last one is, okay, so you have an index, you have the icon, and then the symbol of the sign. So as I'm speaking, not only is there the acoustical blast, which is operating as an index, not only is each word there have some sort of phonetic value that gives it a similarity to other words, so it could be an icon of various items, or even iconic in the sense of a rhyming sequence of poetry. But I guess there is a symbolic aspect, and that is based, rather than similarity, it's based in imputed relations of convention or of historicity, or we sometimes say it's just arbitrary. Now, this is the one I think that most people think of. This is kind of that Saussurean argument where people say, well, words are arbitrary. There's no connection between a word and what it means, and we try to do something like that. Well, that kind of works, but that also doesn't work. That language is symbolic, and that's one of the levels at which the sign can be analyzed. But as I've been trying to say, look, the sign can always be reduced back to its iconicity, or even reduced back to itself as an indice. The indice is caught within the space and time. The icon starts to open a kind of transcendence beyond the sheer materiality. It's an implied, deducible, logical set of relations that give information there. By the time you get into the arbitrariness of the sign, the sign as we recognize it as language, this is why people say that language is open and plastic and frees humans up to an infinite relationship to the world. This is the one that I think sort of liberates us into part of that problem of how is it that when I write, or even better, when I read, even if as I'm reading, my brain is putting information there, the text is able to teach me something. Now, how is the text able to teach me something if all I'm able to do is put there what I already knew? See, there's a sense in which the distinction between texts and minds starts to break down, because texts become the mode of transcendence by which people become who they really are. That is, I have grown into myself by way of escaping the space and time of my body, entering into the historicity of various texts. Now, some people might say, no, it's not real transcendence. It's a fake transcendence because your brain is always in the now, and your brain is just attributing meaning to those texts. I'm going to say yes and no. There is a very real sense in which the text can teach me something, partly because the text is a carrier of meaning that surpasses any given user. And there's a sense in which my own mind grows as incorporating the text. So part of the question for the person who wants to say that information is just simply attributed to the words out there, well, how does my vocabulary grow? I mean, when my brain actually acquires a new word, or when it acquires new distinctions to recognize in the world, how did those distinctions get in there? You can't just say that the brain put them there. See, the distinction between the externalized brain, which at first was literacy and then grew into the computer, and the kind of internal brain we have, some of this gets very problematic. Okay, I've been going on way too long. I'm going to end this discussion on the distinction between different kinds of writing. And I think this will also further part of the the haggle here. Now, there just really quickly 4 kinds of writing I want to talk about. First is the pictograph, and the pictograph has an image. Now, imagine an eyeball, just like in a picture there. The image of a pictograph can be read in any language and paraphrases the rule. And even though it does mean maybe a concept or an idea, or maybe a physical referent or a category of objects being referred to, the photograph or a pictograph is, again, it can be read with no direct literal way. It could be read as the eye, it could be read as the source of sight, it could be read as Illuminati. So there's a lot of different ways that that concept could be spoken of, and it could be spoken of in any different language. Now when you move to an ideograph is where the symbol means an idea or a concept. One of the best examples are the numerals 1, 2, and 3. Now if you think of 1, 2, and 3 as numerals, those are interlingual ideographs. When I say interlingual ideographs, I mean those numbers can be pronounced accurately. 1, 2, 3, they can be pronounced 1, 2, 3, they can be pronounced 1, 2, 3, that, and see what's happening there is the numbers they give the same concept despite not giving information on how to pronounce them. But if I type out the letters O-N-E, T-W-O, T-H-R-E-E, their 1, 2, 3 is a set of instructions for making sounds, and here the iconicity enters in because that symbol rhymes with other elements. And that's, again, it's a form of the information content that is a part of the transcendence that we experience in human language. By the time you move, and I'm just all over the place. So we started with pictograph, we went to ideograph, then rebus. Rebus was the kind of writing that you find in hieroglyphics where you have part of it as a pictograph, but part of it starts to become signs for elements of sound. And now the rather than, again, an image meaning a concept or an idea or some physical referent, to try to think of an image referring to a sound really is quite a significant breakthrough, because sound doesn't have any veneers. Sound has no surfaces. A picture of an eyeball representing an eyeball, there's a physical thing representing another physical thing. But the letters E-Y-E representing the sound, I, is very odd. I mean, one is a physical thing there that you can look at, hold still, it has 3 letters. The other is a veneerless event, has no boundaries that you can recognize with your eye. By the time you get to alphabetic text, and what the text that we come to know, it does seem to have informational capacities radically different than those other forms. I mean, not only was the alphabet the condition for universal translation, not only does the alphabet allow people to read and accurately pronounce texts that they're unable to understand, right? Like the Chinese reader. The Chinese reader has never heard the expression sound it out. The ideograph doesn't contain instructions for making sounds. We can learn to pronounce words that we don't know, and slowly those can become part of our cognitive system. At any rate, I hope that this video was somewhat informative to those people who've been watching my last couple of videos. I do think language is part of a transcendence that is an evolutionary process that we can find throughout the entire natural world. I don't think I'm asking for anything transcendent. If I am, it has to do with those kinds of mathematical objects that we can speak about, which do seem to have some sort of regulative ideal there. Things like pi, like prime numbers. Now, if all humans disappear and this planet goes, it washes under from a nuclear holocaust, if that would happen, I would still want to say that if there are alien life forms out there and people want to believe in anything like that, I think the language that we can imagine that other life forms would speak would be something like mathematics. That mathematics opens us to the kinds of regularity and the forms of information that could be deduced from the world, even from a radically different organism, a radically different life form. I don't think that it has to be base 10 or it has to be binary or it has to be pi, but the notion of abstract deductible forms based on 0 and 1, they seem to be pretty insightful, and they do seem to be a kind of transcendence that has made at least it possible for us to escape this atmosphere. Now, if escaping the atmosphere isn't a kind of transcendence, what is it? Okay, thanks.